Ani bojo shalom, ani bojo benezi dijnakas, shkag dodom anashnabek mangen nodom hodnashoni, Alderville donjiba, North Bay donda anashnabek endau. So I've just told you in some of the language that I know that a name I've been given, Benezi, my family is from Alderville First Nation, and which is near Cobourg, Ontario, and I live in North Bay. Currently live in North Bay, and I'm a citizen of the Anishinaabe Nation. And I was so glad to hear, I think it was Bernie Farber ask a question about genocide, because some of us have lost families in several genocides, and I've been brought up to understand that it's the opinion that counts the most in how you label something are the people who were on the receiving end of it. So I think that sort of speaks for itself. I want to introduce our panelists, and before I do, I think the first panel was so wonderful. There was a lot of wisdom there from the oldest to the youngest member of that panel. And I'm going to put to you the proposition that everything you hear in the next couple of days is about reconciliation. Some people are categorizing reconciliation as we tend to want to silo everything, and reconciliation is not just about two people on that medicine wheel that you've seen with red, white, black, and yellow colors of peoples on it. If reconciliation is done the way it should be, the way that Chief Robert Joseph talked about, individually and talking to one another, that will make Canada better for everybody who lives here, not just about parts of it. We have to start thinking about reconciliation as being really inclusive. And this panel is about inclusivity. And we are privileged that the Mississaugas of the New Credit have allowed us to meet on their territory to talk about this today. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. We are one short, but we have actually added Her Majesty the Queen to join us today. So you know that Indigenous peoples have a strong relationship with the Crown, so she was glad to accept. So I want to introduce Robert Dom, who is an advisor of the Office of the Vice President Students at the University of British Columbia. Oh, sorry. At Simon Fraser University Center for Dialogue. He is a fellow in diversity and innovation. He is a director of the Laurier Institution and a founding director of Reconciliation Canada. He co-convenes the Intercultural and Civic Engagement Strategy Group for the City of Vancouver, and with another UBC colleague, he co-leads an international research consortium of 8 interdisciplinary teams consisting of 33 scholars at 21 universities in 9 countries. And next, I want to introduce Caroline Mibel. Caroline currently heads Zwart Communication, an agency that specializes in multicultural marketing in Quebec. And as the founder, she believes strongly in the power of diversity. Zwart's mandate is to work with its clients to strategically tap into that power. And before launching her own business, Mibel was a political advisor for the Cabinet of Montreal's mayor. And for over 10 years, she has worked passionately in economic development. So welcome and thank you, Caroline. And at the far end, Jack Jedwab, who has, in the interest of time, has drastically abbreviated his introduction for us. But I think I'm going to read it all because we're one panelist short, so we've got time. Jack is the president of the Association for Canadian Studies and the Canadian Institute for Identities and Migration. He holds a PhD in Canadian history from Concordia University. He is taught at the University du Quebec at Montreal and McGill. And he has taught courses on the history of immigration in Quebec, ethnic minorities in Quebec, official language minorities in Canada, and sport in Canada. And he's also written numerous books, journals, essays across the country. So I appreciate you taking the time to be here in the spirit in which this meeting is to take place. And we thought that it might be appropriate to start the discussion with what the panelists have called a launching pad discussion. And the question that was suggested was, what steps should we be taking to help people meaningfully identify with Canada? What steps should we be taking to help people meaningfully identify with Canada? So I'm going to ask Jack if he would start.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me begin by saying thanks to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for inviting me to this session. I'm extremely pleased to be here and see so much expertise in the room and so many people of goodwill, and it's always a great pleasure to be able to participate in that regard. So let me get to the question right away. I feel a bit like it's like Jeopardy. You know, you got to sort of answer the question. And I'll probably answer with a question, right, as opposed to offering an answer. But underlying that question, indeed, is a question. The question is what it means to be Canadian, on the one hand, and there's a second question that underlies it, which is what the word meaningful suggests. So, as regards Canadian, we could have a lengthy discussion about what it means to be Canadian. I'll answer simply, rather than engaging in sort of a detailed or description of what that may or may not mean, that there are many ways of being Canadian, that there's not a singular way. We're often very caught up in trying to define Canadian in those singular terms. We're not alone in that regard, as you know, you can see a lot of countries, Europe, in Europe, for example, and our American neighbors to the south are engaged in very significant debate about what it means to be American or what it means to be European. And very often, you know, those types of debates, when the attempt is made to bring them into some singular equation, are very slippery slope in that they create more division than they create unity, in the sense that there are many ways of being Canadian, and our various experiences and stories are sort of encompass the things that comprise what Canadian identity embodies. But taking the question in reverse, what it means sort of to make people feel excluded from being Canadian, I would argue that it's when you attach stigma to belonging to society or belonging to community. So I would suggest that if we equate being Canadian with belonging to a family, in a family where the children or the siblings feel stigma, they'll feel more excluded. And that's where Canada really encounters a very serious challenge in terms of continuing to offer meaningful opportunities for participation. A lot of the debates we have, debates about values that tend to or evolve towards something that really is an us versus them type of debate, creates stigma for many people. We're seeing communities that feel very stigmatized. I'm going to give an example quite explicitly. I feel people identify as Muslim, as part of the Islamic faith, currently are the object probably of quite disproportionate stigma that arises a lot from our media. And I don't think the type of stigma we attach in that regard helps meaningful opportunities be created. And yet all the polling I do despite that shows very high levels of attachment on the part of people identified that way towards Canada, right? Independent of the stigma that's created on the part of media and other institutions directed at that community. And we've seen examples over the course of our history of stigma created towards various communities. We had sort of heard the very interesting discussion in the previous plenary about historic stigma directed at our Indigenous peoples. So that would be my sort of answer to the question. I could go into more detail, but you know, I think it's better to allow others to continue to provide their insight into the issue.
Okay. Alors, bonjour. Et puis, merci à la Fondation de m'avoir invité. Et là, je vois que tout le monde a peur, pensant que je vais parler tout le temps en français. So, hi, I'm really happy to be here. I've learned a lot this morning with all the previous speakers. There's a lot of similarity, okay, with the Aboriginal people regarding Black. In Canada, there's a lot we can learn from them. So regarding the question, I would like to start with a quote. As such, we find it impossible to accept today as today's Black Canadian experience, extreme marginalization, disadvantage, restricted access to housing, racial profiling in policing, security, education, and child welfare, sorry for the accent and everything, I'm a francophone. Criminalization, overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, high levels of unemployment, and disproportionate and extreme poverty. This is a quote from Anthony Morgan, who is a human rights lawyer, and that was an article he wrote in The Star July last year. Just to give you a sense of Black reality in Canada, I'm not gonna go deep into it, but just so you can have an idea. Black earns 75 cents for every dollar a white worker earns. In average, the unemployment rate is twice the Canadian norm. And you could go, borrow, like in Montreal North, in Montreal, it could go up as 40%, really high. Highly educated Black person with at least a graduate degree can expect a higher rate of unemployment than a Black dropout. So that's a great disillusion, We've been told that if you get, the more educated that you get, the more success you will have. And it's happening for everybody else. It's true for everybody else, except for Black communities. And you were talking about the Muslims being stigmatized?
Stigmatized.
Okay. But so we know, so you could know, and no one is talking about it, but 8 crimes in Canada, Black people will have 7 times greater risk of, in all the 8 crimes that is made in Canada, 7 times targeted Black people. So, but no one is talking about that. So the other thing about this great disillusion for us as Black people is that we have been told, this is Canada. It's not the States, It's not France. So if I go in France or in States, I know what to expect. But being in Canada, I think I've always knew that I was Black, but I never knew that I was that Black, till I've been confronted to all the disadvantage. I find being Black being equality. It's a great heritage because, first of all, I am of Asian descent. So this is something I'm really proud about. I believe this is one of the greatest gifts that God gave me, by being Asian descent. And by being Asian descent, it means that my people somehow embody social justice because we were the first group to have put an end to slavery. We were the first group that opened freedom. And we did that with no means. We did that with no means. And we fought for others as well, So I wanted to say that I'm really proud to be Black, It's not all about disadvantage, and the disadvantage that we are experiencing is mostly because of other people regards on us. But being Black is the greatest thing on earth. All the Black in the place? No? All right. So from our point of view, Canada need to fight anti-Black racism with inclusive economy. For us, because one of the things they did not say, I am the founder of the International Black Economic Forum. It's an organization that is working to accelerate wealth creation among Black people here in Canada and with other partners elsewhere as well. So the idea beyond inclusive economy is to ensuring prosperity prosperity is more broadly shared, especially among those facing greatest barriers to opportunity. If we go that way, it would mean that we need to go in the deepest, in order to have real impact, it would be to happen in the government level. It would have to be systemic. And for it to go deeper again, it will mean that we need to engage the business world. We need to engage media about the importance of inclusive economy. And if we don't do that, as the way we are going, Canada, there will be we will not have a sustainable growth, economic growth as a whole, not as Black people, as Canadian as a whole. Can I go on?
Yeah.
Okay. So, again, usually when people hear about inclusive economy, people have the sense that it means someone will lose something, someone will lose an advantage. But in the contrary, it's the idea about expanding together. And I believe that there's no gain for us as Canadians to have a such group of people, because we have to remember that Blacks in Canada represent the third largest group of people, okay, as minorité visible, visible minority, okay? So more than 1 million people. I don't see what we are gaining as a group to have a lot of people living in disadvantage. And when poverty creates a lot of health problems, a lot of stress, there's a lot of consequences to poverty. And so we will gain as a collective, and the collective is a broader collective, is the Canadian all around the country that will gain for Black people to go up to, to améliorer, to improve their economic state. And so this is me as the founder of the International Black Economic Forum asking and inviting people to make sure that Black people all around the country being able to tap into their potentiality. And Black people, again, I'm saying it and I'm really insisting on that, Black people, by Black people bettering their livelihoods, it will have a greater impact. It will have an impact on everybody. All the refugees that we'll be talking about, all the disadvantaged people will benefit from that. And what the link by being feeling included in Canada. When you don't eat, and when people do not give you the job, even though you have the talent, the wisdom, the intelligence, you don't feel included. And most of the Black people choose to come. Yes, there's a group of Black people that have been in Canada for a long period of time, but most of us, we choose to come here. My parents choose to come here. Therefore, we do want to feel part of Canada, even though I'm from Quebec. So we do want to feel part of the greater collective. But if every time we wake up in the morning, we do know that only because we are Black, we will not have what we are entitled to have, you cannot feel included. In the country, you are excluded. And this is one of the greatest violence that we are, and this economic violence, this is something we are living in a day-to-day basis. And I'm taking the time to talk and to put the emphasis on that, because whenever Black people talk about what they're going through, people have the tendency to say, you're exaggerating, it's not that bad. Yes, it is that bad. Okay, there's a lot of mental illness that it comes out of poverty. So all those problems that we're talking about, you'll be paying for that, you know? So in order for you not to pay for that, I'm talking economically, it's better to embrace it and find solution beforehand. So this is me stopping right now.
Thank you. Thank you. As Chief Robert Joseph said in the opening panel, we have to listen to one another. So we were listening. Thank you. Now we have a last-minute fill-in for a panelist. And can I ask Wendy, is it Cukier, to come up? and I'll introduce her as she comes up. She's the founder of Lifeline Syria and Ryerson University Lifeline Syria Challenge, the founder of the Diversity Institute at Ryerson University, the recipient of the Harry Jerome Diversity Award, and she is the author of more than 200 papers on diversity and inclusion. And that means that Your Majesty, you're excluded. So we now have our complete complement of panelists. And we've talked about people who are here primarily, about inclusion. And I think we have to remember the people who are in the process of coming here. So Wendy, do you want to speak to that? Thank you.
This is one of the most last-minute things I think I've ever done. I came in, got my badge, and was escorted to the front. So thank you very much for this opportunity, I think. So at the Diversity Institute, one of the things we're really interested in is evidence-based change and how research can help advance change. And I think, from our perspective, there's been a shift in recent years from a focus on diversity and celebrating difference to this notion of inclusion and talk about what it means. And I think, Jack talked about the sense of belongingness. Curlin talked about access to power and to economic opportunities as being critically important. And I think the research shows very clearly that in Canada, the glass is half empty as well as half full. So there's no question that our country should be proud of the fact that it has one of the highest rates of social mobility in the world. While it's true, immigrants often come to Canada and end up driving taxis, their kids can as easily become a cabinet minister or the CEO of a company as someone who is Canadian born, and that's unusual and it's something to be proud of. I think we've also seen really good evidence that addressing these issues effectively is linked not just to values that we all cherish in Canada, but also to real economic and social development. And there's no question from the research that doing this well benefits everybody. And I think, again, you pointed to that issue. At the same time, the evidence is pretty clear that we still have a long ways to go. We've done a number of studies that show that, for example, looking at immigrants, there are huge differences between the experiences of immigrants, frankly, that are tied to the color of their skin. And so people who self-identify as being Black experience far more discrimination than other groups of immigrants. We have to confront that head on. It's not just someone's opinion or someone's perception. There's really good solid evidence that suggests that is based in reality. Similarly, that we know that even within a category like Black, there are huge differences between the experience, for instance, of people born in Canada, not born in Canada, people of Caribbean background versus African background. And economic status has huge impacts, and the intersectionality between things like socioeconomic status, race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and so on, are also things that we have to confront head on. We did a study that showed, for example, that women are underrepresented in leadership roles in the GTA. Yeah, tell me something new. But white women outnumber racialized women in leadership roles by 7 to 1, even though for every white woman in the GTA, there's a racialized woman. That tells us that even within the women's movement, and I know there are many people in the room who are very active in that domain, we have to be very careful that efforts, for example, around comply or explain legislation and other initiatives aimed at addressing gender inequality don't focus on one kind of woman and exclude diverse women. So I think there's a lot of complexity around the issue, and I think that we have to hold two thoughts at one time. One, be proud of the fact we are a country of immigrants and refugees. I'm the child of a refugee. But to recognize that we still have a long ways to go. And some of the initiatives that we have been involved in, observing, evaluating, really suggest that you need strategies that are tied to real outcomes and real results. There's far too much rhetoric, there's far too many rainbow posters, there are far too many CEOs who stand up and say diversity is important, who cannot be held accountable based on the results they're actually delivering. And that's hugely critical. We have to look at the relationship between government policy, between representation in the media, and things at the societal level, their connections to actual decisions, policies, and practices in organizations, whether we're talking about the banks or we're talking about the universities. And we have to be prepared to hold people accountable. And then we have to look at individual choice, both the agency of racialized and marginalized populations, the choices that they can make in terms of overcoming barriers and becoming more successful, and the choices that everyone else has to make in terms of creating more inclusive environments. So I'm really thrilled to be here, and it's a real honor to be at the table with such an impressive panel, but also in the room with so many people who've dedicated so many years to moving this project forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for the invitation, and to everyone for being here this week. There was a CBC story on Monday by Laura Da Silva that quoted a young person saying, "I think it's very hard to be a young person. Going out of school, there's no guidance anymore, and you have to find your way in this world and figure out who you are." I'm still trying to figure out who I am too, and I think we all are, and I think that's really at the heart of what we're about here, is trying to figure out who we are as a country. And as a practitioner, the focus of my work is in the universities. And the reason for that is because university it contains perhaps the greatest concentration of diverse individuals around whom most of us will ever be privileged to find ourselves. And I want to say it in French to make a point. L'université représente peut-être de tous les milieux dans lesquels la plupart de nos étudiants auront un jour l'occasion de se retrouver, celui qui offre la plus grande diversité. It is a liminal space and time of learning in relatively close proximity to thousands of people who embody unimaginably diverse ways of knowing and being in the world. In anthropology, liminality is a middle state in a rite of passage. It has associations with transition and ambiguity, of being on a threshold, of a space between. The space between who we are and what we are learning, and who everyone around us is and what they are learning, is what makes universities exciting and important. The space between how each of us sees the world is the fertile ground on which dialogue, collaboration, and reconciliation can take root. Here on Ojibwe lands, on the Coast Salish territories where I am privileged to live and work, and wherever we are in this country. Fruits of scientific discovery, cultural creativity, and humanitarian promise seeded at our universities will sustain generations to come. Not only there, but universities are a concentrated space for that kind of work. It is our diversity that makes our universities a liminal space of infinite possibility. But as long as we remain more or less confined within our cultural, social, and academic silos, we will only scratch the surface of our collective multicultural intelligence. Diversity is embodied in individuals in multiple and radically different ways. Every one of us, and we've heard many examples of that today, is a fluid composite of intersecting differences. such as physical ability, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, nation of origin, life experiences, academic discipline, and so on. There is no good reason for privileging, isolating, or oversimplifying the significance of any one of these differences for a given individual. We must go to where the suffering is greatest, but we are all fluid, composite beings of intersecting differences. We are incommensurable. None of us can be reduced to an objective diversity classification or squeezed into a set of diversity boxes. I need to hear your important stories and ideas in order to know who you are. This is why we should foster not only intercultural understanding, but also intersubjective dialogue and interdisciplinary collaboration skills. For many reasons, identity diversity is an essential place to start, particularly in order to achieve equity wherever we encounter the systemic injustice of underrepresentation or oppression of marginalized groups. We must begin there, and we must pursue identity diversity in our institutions with vigor. But stopping at identity diversity would constitute a failure of imagination, and it would ignore decades of research about innovation and creativity. Cognitive diversity is the hidden value of intercultural understanding and interdisciplinary learning. Engaging our campus's cognitive diversity more intentionally, far more intentionally, can generate innovation in research and learning, and it can foster social sustainability. Dialogue and collaboration can spark a healthy curiosity about other ways of being and knowing. Certainly, we can demand tolerance, and we can prohibit discriminatory behavior. What we cannot effectively legislate respect for diverse others. Curiosity about what other people know can help to uproot the seeds of racism and xenophobia, and it can also create knowledge. Research shows the cognitive advantage of individuals who possess what David C. Thomas calls multicultural intelligence. So too, cognitively diverse teams that are able to collaborate can be better at solving some kinds of problems than homogeneous teams, as Scott Page has shown. Cognitive diversity is our university's greatest asset, and it is a diverse Canada's asset. And this is why skills and experiences in dialogue and collaboration are vital. Even very diverse universities can breed academic, cultural, and social silos, and proximity to diversity does not lead automatically to the cross-pollination of ways of knowing and being required for social sustainability, deep equity, and innovation. We cannot catch other people's wisdom like an airborne pathogen simply by being on a university with students from 100 countries. At universities, these silos are sustained by many factors, such as important requirements for degree specialization, language barriers, cultural affinities, and social interests, extracurricular commitments, economic factors, commuting patterns, and so on. Because a majority of our graduates are settling in the regions where they go to school, these silos have long-term implications for social cohesion and creativity in our cities, as well as for innovation in our universities, businesses, and other enterprises and communities. This is why intercultural dialogue and interdisciplinary collaboration skills and experiences are essential for Canadian universities in the 21st century. To conclude, dialogue is not merely a conversation. It is an opportunity to build on one another's ideas, as well as to discover the many things that unite us. Dialogue is what Professor Mark Winston, Canada's leading honeybee scientist, calls a concentrated conversation. Racism and systemic injustices of all kinds are complex and important challenges. They require the collective wisdom of all of us. This is why what we need to be aiming for in this conference and in other gatherings of this kind, where we explore the creative tension between diversity and unity, is not by practicing the polite combat of debate, but rather by practicing the art of concentrated conversation, the skill of genuine dialogue, the science of collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are a lot of people in this room and on this panel who have a lot of knowledge, and about these issues. And what I hear more and more often, and in particular what I heard from Wendy and Carolanda, and from all the panelists, but in particular from those two, there's been a lot of talk over the years about racism and discrimination. And I think what I'm hearing, and I'm going to ask each panelist based on what they've heard from their colleagues, to maybe explore a bit at depth about this. But what I'm hearing is, I think Wendy said that we've had lots of rhetoric, and what Carolanda said is, inclusion has to be more than just, engaging in dialogue with people, and it's more than words. It's accepting people as a neighbor in your condo, as someone who you work with in your workplace. That's where the rubber hits the road. That's where all the polite, nice words about discrimination and racism really are put to the test. So I'm going to ask if, in no particular order, just if anybody wants to be the first, if they would talk about taking this discussion to the next level, I think would be a good way to go. Jack, do you want to go?
So in terms of taking this discussion to the next level, I actually came with something a bit more prepared, but I dropped it, for an answer to the question about meaningfulness and being Canadian and so forth. I'll probably revert back to what my prepared sort of observation was. But I'm of the opinion that we do need to reconcile the discourse that we use and the realities on the ground to a very significant degree. And very often, a lot of discourse that we use is quite lofty and wouldn't be very meaningful to people who, for example, when I was in Winnipeg last weekend, are at Portage and whatever corner street and not doing particularly well. Maine, thank you very much, Anita. Portage and Maine and not doing particularly well. And, I don't think a lecture about social cohesion or common values would have significant resonance to those people or address really those sort of core challenges that they're encountering, where we need to really focus on what the best practices are for addressing some of that. I sometimes feel that personally I'm getting removed from that reality, and I find that's true for a number of my colleagues with whom I interact. And we're very caught up in some of the sort of common discourse and language we use, and I'm not always really understanding, despite the fact I've pursued a couple of those graduate degrees for the value that they give you. I'm not understanding some of the terminology we're using, like we use social cohesion as a term quite frequently, and I have asked a lot of people for what that means, and I get sort of 30 definitions of what it means, to be honest with you. But it's a term that's become part and parcel of our vocabulary. And I say this with all due respect and deference to those people who use it, including many of my students who use it. Some of whom use it because it's been used in the classroom. They think they get better marks by, repeating what the prof says. But Albert actually mentioned something about multiculturalism at the front. He referred to a poll that we had the sort of opportunity to do jointly with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. I did want to talk very quickly about multiculturalism, and but without sort of getting into that gap between the theoretical and the realities that we need to deal with quite practically when it comes to situations that people are encountering on the ground. So he referred to one question. 63% of people agree that Canadian multiculturalism allows people to pursue certain cultural practices that are incompatible with Canadian laws and norms, right? So I'm sure that those people who are critical of multiculturalism will seize on that type of question and say, there you go, it's a fail, right? But the rest of the poll had a lot of good news about multiculturalism, right? So other questions, multiculturalism contributes to, hang on, here we go, let me get my glasses. Can multiculturalism bring people together? Does it bring people together more than it divides them? 56% of people said yes. Does it make it easier for immigrants to adopt shared values? 58% of people said yes. Does it contribute to social cohesion, whatever that means, right? 54% of people said yes. And does it have a positive impact on ethnic and religious minorities? 64% of people said yes. So, what's the truth? The truth is that, very often in these survey questions, some of which I've been engaged in myself, but also been critical of in the media in terms of the way they're formulated, people don't understand the questions that we're putting to them, and we're often offering them statements that lead them to provide specific responses. But I'm a defender of multiculturalism as a discourse both, but as well in practice, and I think we need to have some conceptual framework to operate from that guides us in terms of our attitudes, because we can work on our attitudes, and our attitudes need constant work. right? We can't take our attitudes for granted in terms of the perceptions we have of the other, in terms of the way we're dividing up us and them, which we're seeing happening in a lot of places around the planet, including Canada. A recent poll that was done by Environics with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation found that 54% of people agree that there are too many immigrants coming to this country who are not adopting Canadian values. Let me submit to you that the 50% of people, or at least a fair number of them, are wrong. That statement is that the statement and the response is an incorrect statement based on a lot of distortion that's going on both in the media, both in terms of what we're seeing around the globe. Now, the nice thing about the survey is it asked a number of other questions where the very same people who said that there are too many immigrants who are not adopting our values suggest that they're wrong, actually, because 95% of the people, immigrants and non-immigrants that are surveyed, and by the way, even immigrants respond yes to that question at 55%. So a lot of immigrants are saying, there are too many immigrants that are not adopting Canadian values. It's not us immigrants, it's those immigrants, so clearly. But when they're asked about whether they respect gender equality, whether it's important for men and women to be treated, 95% of Canadians, immigrant and non-immigrants, say yes, that is very important. Right? And really, very often when you use the term values, it's an agenda that's masking something else, right? You're not sharing our values. Well, what do you mean by values? Our values. Yeah, what do you mean by, like in Quebec, we'll probably say gender equality. But when we ask those very same people, 95% of them are saying that they respect the equality of men and women, even though, again, we get into what is going on the ground. Wendy gave a good example of it. There are significant and glaring inequalities despite these beliefs, right? So, we'll say, well, someone's not telling the truth in this thing. No, it's not that they're not telling the truth, right? So the questions submitted to them are not getting us at the answers or the best practices we need to put in place to address some hard realities. And we need to rethink some of those things. Let me make a final comment about multiculturalism, which I defend. A lot of people have been critical of multiculturalism across the spectrum, right? Really, certainly amongst conservatives, certainly amongst those on the other end of the ideological spectrum who feel it's not resolving our problems. In and of itself, of course, the resources attached to multiculturalism could barely scratch the surface in terms of resolving some of the problems that we need to address. But I will say this, I've done some scaling on multiculturalism. Those people who say that they have a very positive view of multiculturalism, 20% of the population, very positive, right? Another 30% somewhat positive, another 30% a little less positive, another 20% very negative. The very positive have, when I correlate, a very positive view than the majority of Muslims, Jews, immigrants, and indigenous peoples. The very negative ones who say, I don't like multiculturalism, it doesn't work, it's terrible. They also have a negative view, and they say this quite openly, of Muslims, indigenous peoples, Jews, and immigrants. Personally, I prefer that we model after those people that have a very positive view of multiculturalism, at least as regards its message. In terms of the policies we implement, clearly we need to continue to identify the people most vulnerable in our society who are on the ground in cities and outside of cities and try to get, as Wendy suggested, through empirical and other types of research, what is the cause of these situations and what are the solutions, which we're not doing enough of because we're too caught up with rhetoric, at least I would suggest, that I've described earlier. I won't repeat because I make less friends whenever I sort of talk about what does social cohesion really mean instead of just using the term, and what do values actually mean, and what do you mean when you use the term values or shared values, right? Which people don't offer answers for. We're not going to get them from Kelly Leach, I can assure you, right? We're not going to get them from Donald Trump, I can guarantee you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jack. And we have a few minutes just for another panelist before we throw the floor open if anybody wants to add. Caroline?
So regarding your question, and to reinforce what, I think Wendy. Sorry, Wendy.
My name's not on the list.
For me, accountability is something that is really key. I will give. I talked with Ruben about the Environics survey sometime this morning, and we were talking about generic question versus specific question. But one of the things I wanted to say was that I was a big fan of Environics, so I don't know if they are there. But I find that from my point of view, Environics itself is biased. I've read one of the books that the Nation, I forgot about the name completely, but it's about Nation, it went out last year. So because they are Environics, I went by it and I was happy to start to read it. And as I was reading it, I saw that whenever it's the narrative of the data, they were skipping the Black experience. I would have to go and look and read the data itself, the graphics itself, to know, okay, Black people did answer, that Black people did do that. And even though some of the research they done would have been great would have been able to showcase something good about Black experience, it will not be taken in account. So people usually don't read the graphics, don't take the time to analyze the graphics. So by skipping systematically about the Black experience, therefore we are non-existent. Okay, so yes, for the people that are answering the questions, but the people that are framing those questions are also biased. And that's something I wanted to say. And now, going back to accountability, the Board of Commerce in Montreal, they did a survey among the big CEOs of Quebec, of Montreal actually. And the main reason why immigrants were not getting jobs in Quebec was that they're not speaking French or good French. Okay. For those who live in Quebec and that are immigrant in Quebec, that's a big fat, because it's not true. Quebec is in charge of immigration. So they choose people that speak French, or at least has a good understanding and capacity to talk, to speak French, So that could not be the reason. And for people like myself, who has been raised I've learned everything in Quebec. So you cannot use that as a reason not to, hire me. So the reason I'm linking that to accountability is that as long as we're not imposing something, we're always going to get those easy answers. Answers that will always, I'm not responsible for it. You guys, the immigrants, you are the one that still has to do a lot of work in order to get where you want to be. So for me, there's I don't know if it's quotas. I am for quotas, actually, because just I wanted to say about quotas was that the first quotas in Canada was used for francophone, Canadian francophone men in the federal service.
Civil service, yeah.
And it works, because there's no such thing today for to hire francophone in the government, federal government. So it works. So quota can be a good tool for immigrants as well. And again, the first Black minister in Quebec, Yolande James, one of the first things she did when she est arrivée
when she arrived in power, when she got the power.
When she got the power. But with the power she got, she did something good. She developed a fund for Black entrepreneurs, So I used to be the chairwoman of La Jeune Chambre, the Asian Youth Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah.
I have to do that. So when I was in power, I had to work to the renewal for this fund. But the government of Quebec was saying they did not want to renew it because we were not having as much results that we should be doing. So this money was split into 4 groups, 4 groups, with one resources for the whole Black people of Quebec, not only Montreal, but of Quebec. And if you took the results of those groups, we were doing really great regarding the same fund for women entrepreneurs. I know I was the one that works to create that women's fund, So with the Black fund, they were saying there's not enough results, we should shut it down. For the other one, they won a prize for that, for the fact that they have less result than their counterpart. So c'est 2 poids, 2 mesures. So there again, the government, we as a collective, we need to for them to be the government, Justin Trudeau I know it's federal, but Justin Trudeau. He said last year, I believe, that this is 2015, so therefore this is why there's half-half women. It was not 2015 for black people last year. We got everyone as minister, and there was no black. And I know for sure that Emmanuel Dubourg, the one in Montreal, is one of the brightest guy ever. He's nice. This is something that is not appreciated in politics. He's a nice guy, you know? But he's one of the brightest guys, so there was no reason for us not having at least one black people. So we need to, comment on dit les garder en termes d'imputabilité?
You got to keep them accountable.
Yeah,
Accountability.
that.
Keep them accountable.
Okay? Oh, I like that. All their feet to the fire, you know? So, and this is our responsibility. I can go on in terms of example where we are taking things for granted. We have the mayor, Coder, in Montreal, that every immigrant's like, because this Coder is a good father, you know? So, and people trust him. But this is the guy, when he's talking about diversity, it's only a show. There's a lot of things that he could do, but he's not doing. And he has the power, the influence to do it, and he has the trust of most of the immigrants. I'm not one of those people that trust him, but I can recognize that he has the power for that and to do meaningful changes, you know? So we need to hold them hold their feet to the fire. And I'm closing with that, saying that McKinsey did a study saying that if you have women in the board, you will see your financial performance go high as much as 19%. If you choose to do the same thing with only one immigrant, one on the board, you will see the same financial performance go up as 37%. So it's what we're talking about, it's not about virtue, you know? It's first about basic humanity, and secondly, economic gain for every one of us, okay? I'm stopping
Thank
there.
you. Thank you. Thank you very much.